Once in a small village cradled between rolling green hills and a silver river, there lived a little girl named Elara. She had her mother's warm brown eyes and her father's stubborn, hopeful smile. Their cottage was modest, just 3 rooms and a garden, but inside those walls lived the softest kind of happiness, the kind made of morning porridge, bedtime stories, and hands clasped together during evening prayers. Her mother, Myra, was a gentle woman who smelled of lavender and fresh bread. She taught Elara how to tend the garden, how to name the stars, and how to be kind to strangers, even when kindness felt costly. Every night before sleep, Myra would brush Elara's hair 100 strokes and whisper, "You are loved, my darling. The world may be hard, but love is harder. Never forget." But the winter Elara turned 7 was a merciless one. The frost came early and stayed long. Myra fell ill in October and was gone before the first snow melted. Elara's father, Thomas, was a carpenter, strong with his hands but fragile with grief. He wept for months in quiet. He forgot to eat, he forgot to laugh, he forgot slowly how to be present. By the time spring returned to the village, Thomas had met a widow from the next town, a woman of sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes. Her name was Renata. She wore expensive dresses for a woman of her station, and she smiled with her mouth but never with her eyes. The villagers whispered, but Thomas was too broken to notice the difference between warmth and performance. They married on a Tuesday, which Elara always thought was a sad day for a wedding. Renata brought with her 2 daughters, Petra and Sophie, girls with pouty lips and expensive ribbons, and a talent for causing trouble while appearing innocent. The moment Renata walked through the cottage door, she looked around at the simple wooden furniture, the hand-stitched curtains, and the garden full of Myra's roses, and something behind her eyes hardened like stone. It started small, the way cruelty always does. First, Elara's bedroom was given to Petra and Sophie, who complained the room was too small but better than nothing. Elara was moved to the attic, a cramped space with a slanted ceiling, a single window the size of a book, and a straw mattress that smelled of mice. She didn't complain, her father didn't notice. Then came the chores. Renata drew up a list, a long, unreasonable list, and pinned it to the kitchen wall with a rusted nail. Elara was to wake before sunrise, start the fire, fetch water from the well, prepare breakfast, clean the kitchen, wash the laundry, tend the garden, scrub the floors, and be invisible by dinner time. Petra and Sophie, meanwhile, were permitted to sleep until noon and spend their days preening in front of mirrors. When Thomas came home each evening, tired and sawdust-covered, Renata would greet him with a warm smile and a hot meal. "Your daughter is such a hard worker," she would say sweetly. "We're so proud of her." Thomas would nod, relieved that his household seemed to be running smoothly, and retreat to his chair by the fire. He was not a cruel man, he was simply an absent one, and absence in its own quiet way can be just as damaging as cruelty. One afternoon, Elara was sweeping the front step when Renata appeared in the doorway, her silk robe dragging on the floor Elara had just cleaned. She looked at Elara the way one looks at furniture, useful but unremarkable. "You missed a spot," she said, pointing to a perfectly clean corner. "Do it again, and when you're done, polish the silverware, both sets." Elara looked up, met Renata's cold gaze, and felt something stir in her chest, not yet anger but the seed of it. She said nothing. She swept the step again, but she held her chin a little higher as she did. The one place Renata had not managed to ruin was the garden. It was Myra's garden, wild and fragrant and full of deep red roses that bloomed impossibly, even in cold seasons. Elara would steal away there in the early mornings before the rest of the house stirred and sit among the roses and feel for a moment that her mother was still close. One such morning, just as the sun was turning the sky from black to gray, Elara knelt among the roses and wept softly. She was 8 years old and exhausted in a way no child should be exhausted, not just in her body but in her heart. "Mama," she whispered, touching the petals of the darkest rose. "I'm so tired, I don't know how to keep going." The rose did not answer, of course, but the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender, Myra's scent, though no lavender grew in the garden. Elara breathed it in deeply, and somehow inexplicably when she stood she felt steadier. She wiped her eyes and went to fetch the morning water. This became her ritual, every morning, every season. The garden was her church and the roses were her congregation, and whatever she whispered there seemed to be heard by something, even if she couldn't say what. Renata naturally hated the garden. She called it an eyesore of weeds and threatened on several occasions to have it dug up. But curiously, whenever she approached the rose bushes, she broke out in a rash that lasted for days. She blamed bees, then bad air, then a bad constitution, but she never set foot among the roses again. Elara secretly was grateful. When Elara was 10, a merchant came to town selling fine cloth and exotic spices. Thomas, wanting to impress his new wife, spent what little savings the family had on fine wool for Renata's new dress and silk ribbons for Petra and Sophie's hair. There was nothing left over. The winter that year was lean and cold. Renata's solution was surgical. The household's food portions were redistributed. She and her daughters ate first and fully. Thomas, too distracted by guilt and hard work, ate whatever was placed before him. Elara ate last, and last meant whatever remained, which was often not much. A heel of bread, a cold cup of thin soup, sometimes nothing at all. Elara grew pale and hollow-cheeked. Her dress hung loose on her frame. The neighbors noticed and whispered, but no one wanted to interfere in a man's household. The village baker's wife, old Mrs. Henning, would sometimes slip Elara a warm roll when she came to collect the family's order. "You look like a ghost child," she'd say, pressing the bread into Elara's hands. "Eat, eat quickly before she sees." Elara survived that winter on stolen bread and sheer stubbornness. By spring, a quiet fire had ignited in her, no longer just the seed of anger but something closer to resolve. She began to see her situation clearly for the first time, without self-pity clouding her vision. She was in a war, she realized. She had simply not known it until now. The village had a small school, a single room with wooden benches and a cracked chalkboard. Renata did not believe Elara needed schooling. "She already knows enough to clean a house," she said. "What else does she need?" But the schoolmaster, Mr. Aldrich, was a lanky, principled man who believed that every child in the village had the right to learn. He came personally to the cottage one autumn morning and stood firm on the doorstep until Renata, flustered by his stubbornness, relented. Elara walked to school in worn shoes and a patched dress, her chores done before dawn so Renata couldn't complain she was shirking. And in that cracked chalkboard room, something extraordinary happened. Elara discovered she was brilliant. Numbers bent to her will. Words came easily. History fascinated her. She absorbed everything Mr. Aldrich taught as though she had been starving for it, which, in a way, she had been. She also made a friend. Lena was the schoolmaster's daughter, a bold, freckled girl who wore her opinions the way other girls wore jewelry. She looked at Elara on the first day, took in the patched dress and the careful quietness, and said without preamble, "You're the carpenter's daughter. I've heard about your stepmother. She sounds perfectly awful." Elara blinked, then laughed, the first real laugh in what felt like years. "She is," she said, and just like that she had an ally. Lena brought Elara home for dinner when she could. Mrs. Aldrich, a small, bustling woman who considered underfeeding a child something close to criminal, would pile Elara's plate high and refill it without asking. These evenings were windows into another world, a world of warmth and noise and laughter and safety, and Elara carried them in her chest like lanterns for the dark walk home. When Elara was 12, Mr. Aldrich submitted her work to a regional scholarship competition, a program run by the city's great academy that awarded full tuition and housing to exceptional students from rural villages. He did this without telling Renata. He did not trust her to allow it. Elara won. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, addressed to her in official gold-embossed script. Renata intercepted it at the door. What Renata told Thomas that evening: "Some school sent a form letter, nothing important, I threw it out." What Renata told Elara that evening: nothing at all. But she had not counted on Mr. Aldrich, who had also received a copy of the result. He arrived at the cottage 2 days later, letter in hand, face bright with pride. "Your daughter has won a scholarship to the academy," he told Thomas. "She could have an extraordinary future." The room went very quiet. Thomas looked at the letter, then he looked at Renata, whose face was a practiced mask of mild surprise and delight. "Wonderful, of course, we were going to tell you as soon as we'd had time to discuss it," she said smoothly, as though the intercepted letter had never existed. Thomas looked at Elara, really looked, perhaps for the first time in years. She was standing in the kitchen doorway in her worn dress, hands rough from scrubbing, and she met his gaze steadily. Something shifted behind his eyes, something cracked open. That night, Thomas came to Elara's attic room, stooping under the low ceiling, and sat on the edge of her straw mattress. He looked around the cramped space as though seeing it for the first time. His face fell slowly, like a building coming down brick by brick. "Is this where you sleep?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "Yes, Papa," Elara said. He said nothing for a long time. Then, "I'm sorry, Elara, I have not been here, I have not seen you." Elara did not rage, she did not weep, she simply said, "I know, Papa, but I'm still here." Thomas began to pay attention, and Renata's carefully constructed kingdom began to wobble. He moved Elara back to her proper bedroom. He asked about her chores, her meals, her schooling. For the first time in years, Renata's control was being observed, and observation is the enemy of cruelty that hides in shadow. Renata predictably did not accept this gracefully. She tried tears, long theatrical weeping sessions in which she claimed Elara had always been difficult, always been ungrateful, always made the household unhappy. Thomas listened politely and said nothing. Then he went and had dinner with Mr. Aldrich's family, who confirmed, gently but thoroughly, everything Elara had endured. Renata's next approach was sabotage. The Academy scholarship required a final in-person examination in the city, a 3-day journey. Renata arranged very deliberately for the household cart to break down on the morning of departure. The wheel, she said, had simply given out. Thomas found the broken pin that had been removed. He held it up and looked at Renata for a long time. He did not shout. He simply saddled his own horse, lifted Elara up behind him, and rode through the night to reach the city in time. Elara sat the examination. She passed it with the highest score in a decade. The morning after they returned, Thomas sat Renata down at the kitchen table. Petra and Sophie hovered in the doorway. The house was very quiet. Outside, the roses in the garden were in extraordinary bloom, deeper red than Elara had ever seen, filling the morning air with their impossible sweetness. Thomas placed the broken pin on the table. He placed the intercepted letters envelope, which Mrs. Henning from the bakery had found in the rubbish and quietly kept beside it. He spoke quietly and precisely about what he had failed to see and what he had finally begun to understand. The attic room, the empty dinner portions, the worn-through shoes, the rough and chapped hands of a child who had been treated as a servant in her own home. Renata opened her mouth to perform innocence one final time. Thomas raised his hand not in anger but like a man closing a book. "I don't need to hear it," he said. "I only need to tell you that my daughter is leaving for the academy next month, and when she goes she will leave this house happy. You will make that possible, do you understand me?" Renata's power had always rested on Thomas's inattention. Without it, she had nothing. She folded her hands in her lap and said nothing. It was the most honest thing she had done in years. The day Elara left for the academy, she rose before dawn, out of habit, but for the last time as an obligation. She made herself a proper breakfast and ate it sitting at the kitchen table slowly, because she had learned that food eaten slowly tastes better and means more. She went to the garden. The roses were blazing even this early, even in the cool morning dark. She knelt among them one final time and pressed her hands gently against the petals of the darkest rose. "I'm going, Mama," she whispered. "I'm going to be okay. I think you always knew I would be." The wind moved, lavender-scented, soft, unmistakable. Elara smiled, and it was a smile so full and certain that it made her look, for just a moment, exactly like her mother. Thomas was waiting by the cart, bags loaded, eyes red from a night of difficult feelings. He helped Elara up and held her hand for a moment before releasing it. "Your mother would be so proud," he said, his voice cracked. "I am so proud, I should have said it 1,000 times before now." "You're saying it now, Papa," Elara said. "That's enough." Renata and her daughters stood on the cottage step as the cart pulled away. Petra and Sophie looked uncertain, as though they had expected to feel triumphant and instead felt something uncomfortably close to shame. Renata said nothing. She watched the cart until it disappeared around the bend, and then she went inside. The garden roses continued to bloom long after Elara left, wilder and more beautiful than before, as though something in them had been set free. Elara thrived at the academy. She studied medicine, driven by the memory of her mother's illness and the helplessness of not knowing what to do. By the time she was 20, she had become the youngest physician the academy had ever certified. She returned to the village not with bitterness, but with a doctor's bag and the desire to make sure no child in the valley went without proper food or care. She set up a clinic near the river and worked there for the rest of her long and quiet life. Lena, her childhood friend, became her first assistant, a fierce, competent woman who kept the clinic's books, terrified anyone who mistreated patients, and remained Elara's dearest companion for life. Thomas spent his remaining years rebuilding the trust he had let erode. He was not a villain, only a man who had let grief make him careless. He worked hard and loved his daughter well and visited her clinic every Sunday with fresh bread from Mrs. Henning's bakery. Renata, well, without Thomas's blind devotion and Elara as a target, her household lost its shape. Petra and Sophie grew up, married, and moved away. Renata sold the cottage and moved to the city to be closer to them. She lived adequately, if not happily. She thought of Elara sometimes in the way one thinks of a contest they lost, not with guilt exactly, but with a vague, unexamined awareness that something had not gone as it ought to have. She never went back to the village. She never saw the garden again, which had, by then, grown so wild and fragrant that travelers would detour off the road just to stand at its gate and breathe. Years later, a young girl came to Elara's clinic, pale and hollow-cheeked, with careful eyes and rough hands that suggested she worked too hard and ate too little. Elara looked at her and recognized something immediately. She gave the girl a proper meal first, then she tended to whatever had brought her in, then she sat with her for a long time in the quiet and said simply, "You are not invisible, I see you, tell me what's been happening." The girl told her, and Elara listened the way her mother had listened, the way Mrs. Henning had listened, the way Mr. Aldrich had listened, with the full weight of her attention, as though the girl's story was the most important thing in the world. Because, to Elara, it was. When the girl left, with food, with medicine, with a letter of introduction to Mr. Aldrich's school, she walked differently than she had walked in. Head a little higher, shoulders a little less bowed, eyes carrying the first flicker of something that had not been there before. Hope is the most stubborn thing alive. It survives bad winters and cruel words and absent parents and intercepted letters. It survives attic rooms and empty soup bowls and torn shoes. It grows in gardens no one planted, blooms when no one expects it, and finds its way, eventually, always eventually, into the light. If this story touched your heart, like, share, and subscribe. Drop a rose emoji in the comments if you read all the way to the end. New stories every week. See you next time.